Soviet Union was really trying to impose its values and wills on others, where Russia just wants to be left alone to keep the regime in power and to have its little sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, also more as a security belt, without really spreading it.
So we don't like so much to refer on the Soviet period. But so there is discussion, of course, what we do with this, because it's also cultural heritage. So we also work for getting this consciousness that
so up until 1980, in the latter part of the 70s, there was 5 deals with the International Monetary Fund. So basically, after Tito's death, Yugoslavia was not controlling its economy practically.
this Friendship Park is somehow a material or physical representation of the politics, international, especially international politics of socialist Yugoslavia during the 60s.
And the war started at the beginning of August 2008, after the summit, the NATO summit in Bucharest, where Georgia and Ukraine were kind of getting promised that they would become member one day. Probably that one of the reasons why the Russians decided to do this war was that they wanted to prevent this, to give a lesson, to show to the West that this should not happen, otherwise it would be the war.
Chinese rhetoric of win-win talk about economic interdependence between two countries. Most of the time, it's not an equal interdependence. One side is not as dependent of the other side and the other side. So you normally have an asymmetry in such a relationship.
So I think that with Belt and Road, there was this big, beautiful slogan, and then everybody started to touch the stones and trying to cross the river and figure out what that actually means. If you can imagine Chinese context when the big words drop out of Xi Jinping's mouth, everybody, of course, wants to follow suit.
The idea of this prix or obor or whatever we call it is very vague in the beginning. It's just a vision, no details, so everybody can basically say, I want to be part of it.
Poor infrastructure cannot bring the investors. No one can build a factory, and no one wants to build a factory without a good connection.
In some cases, these roads, these bypass roads, also mark a kind of border around Palestinian areas, and in some cases they're not allowed to use the roads, and they're not allowed even to get on the road. So Palestinians know that they're not allowed on the road.
Indeed, but also there is the hidden, which we believe more toxic colonization, which is the colonization of mind. We call the occupation of knowledge, no? Because it goes deep in your subconscious. So we wanted to, in many ways, emancipate ourselves from this. We wanted to basically, again, give meaning to what exists in the refugee camp, to the history of the refugee camp.
In East Jerusalem, Palestinian population has been discriminated against by all state authorities right after the annexation. And there too, you have Israeli settlers moving to live in the midst of Palestinian neighborhoods, in the midst of Palestinian population. And so this is sort of a process of we call it Hebronization.
And I think it's a permanent paradox that when we say one country, two systems, what comes first? Is it more important to protect the two systems or more important to demonstrate one country, that I think is a permanent paradox.
Because Singapore is a city, it's a global city with a more cosmopolitan complexion. When these Indonesians come over and these Malaysian Chinese come over, they kind of disappear into the plurality and they disappear into the diversity of the global city. They become invisible.
I mean, we have some sort of a document that allows them sort of to stay in Germany. They're registered as a Moroccan citizen living in Germany. But when Germany says, well, this is a criminal and therefore, you know, normally that should be sent back, it was impossible because the Moroccan embassy doesn't send a passport.
I say where I have to go, and I came from the train station, and they not let us there. And shopkeeper, they not let us front of the shops, and they not let us on bus station, and you not let us here on the park, where we have to go. Can you show me some place to go there?
Vladimir Putin wrote a number of articles on his behalf, explaining his positions about security, defense, economy. But in his article about foreign policy, he wrote that Russia is a part of a greater Europe.
Europe participated in the war against itself because that aggression was not aimed at Serbia. That, first of all, it was aimed against Russia, and second, against Europe, to demonstrate that Europe is unable to do anything without United States.
I mean, there's no difference in terms of sort of like, you know, I don't want to say right, but in terms of like living between someone who lives in the city and someone who lives in a refugee camp.
So the Western idea of an internationalism inside the country doesn't include different traditions, different way of lives, well, different approaches. So it includes a mix and the merging in something new. And this is, by the way, also what we have in Europe when we speak about multiculturalism.
So we are actually now, you know, you have to imagine that Soviet Union was a huge country, and we were part of this huge country. And suddenly, this huge country, as an illusion, disappeared just.
It's very hard to create integration as a whole world, but we tried. First, we will create Eurasian Union, then maybe we will create the integration of all the world.
Russia and China will cooperate one with the other on implementation of both strategic projects, Belt and Road and Eurasia Economic Union.
And we sort of like to think about it as a new internationalism. So if you look at the infrastructure needs in Asia, they're massive, and there's estimates in the trillions of dollars of a gap.
Now it's about more than ever the interface between the China money trying to be internationalized and then the international flow of money. So how to change RMB into US dollars.